Diving into some important enhancement for our API backend. We'll be focusing on adding a robust test endpoint and a crucial user deletion feature while leveraging the capabilities of Gemini for assistance. So in this tutorial, we'll be walking through the process of implementing these two key features. This is especially relevant for anyone building applications that handle user data or require any monitoring. For context, this is our code base. I've developed a utility script which consolidates most of the relevant source code into a single file. This approach definitely allows me to provide a comprehensive context to Gemini, which helps it understand the project structure more effectively. And here we are in Gemini Studio, and I'm pasting the entire relevant source code here. The goal is for the AI to analyze the code and understand its architecture, which will then help us generate the new features. Well, as you can see, Gemini had analyzed the code, and the first thing we need to do currently is to ensure that Postgres database is running, because this API is using Postgres database for storage. And as you can see, I've defined the database URL. I'm currently running a localhost Postgres, and since I'm using a Linux, I need to first ensure that the Postgres service is running, and you can do that simply by running sudo systemctl start Postgres. That will simply start the PostgreSQL database. I enter my password, and yeah, I think it's now. Let's check the status, and as you can see, yeah, it's active and it's currently run. I had configured and created a database specifically for this API. So the other thing that we need to do is I also have Postman for testing most of the endpoints. So let's start the API service and see what, or rather maybe check some of the endpoint and see whether everything is running as expected. So let's quickly verify it's running at localhost at port 4000, and I'm currently running it in development mode. So let's do a simple get request. Let's do a simple get request in Postman. We copy the URL and head over to Postman, test the endpoint. As you can see, we have a response. It includes a welcome message, the current server time, and some placeholder URLs for the documentation, which aren't active yet. I don't have a domain configured for this yet, so those are just placeholders. So this just gives us a basic information of the server is responsive. Now let's move to our first feature we want to implement, a dedicated test or health check endpoint. Maybe first before we ask Gemini the help with that, it's beneficial to provide it to the Prisma schema. So this file defines our database models and their relationship. I'll copy the entire schema content, and now I'll paste this into Gemini Studio, giving it a clear picture of our data structure. I'll also add a prompt to clarify that this is the Prisma home schema. Please analyze it. Well, this will ensure that Gemini will process it correctly and match it with the codebase that I had shared earlier. So let's see how it processes this. I'm currently using Gemini 2.5 Pro, which I find it really good with its 1 million context windows. It really works well with such huge code bases. Okay, now as you can see it's a thinking model, and as you can see, currently processing and thinking before responding. Well, so now that Gemini has the context of both our application logic and data model, we can proceed by implementing the first feature, which is just a simple test endpoint. I'm thinking of route like maybe test or health. So the purpose of this is to provide a quick status check when called. It should confirm that the API service is running, and importantly that it can successfully connect 2. And query the database. This is invaluable for setting up some monitoring services. Maybe you have a monitoring service you need to set up. So we can prompt the AI and ask it whether it can implement a status endpoint for the API health check. This will be integrated directly. I think we can integrate it directly in the app.js, which is very, very straightforward instead of starting defining other routes. But let's see what Gemini is thinking about. Okay, Gemini has provided some code. It has correctly identified the need to import the Prisma client, which is essential for interacting with the database. So this suggests the suggested approach, I think, involves a simple database query, perhaps something like select one to confirm the database connectivity. If the query is successful, we know that the database is responsive. This looks like a solid plan, so we will add this endpoint logic into the app.js file. Well, I think it's straightforward. We just define the route, import the Prisma client, and execute a minimal query which will return a status. So these utility endpoints are often simple but play a crucial role in application maintainability. Maybe you can find that the API is running but it can't reach the database. So this simple endpoint will be able to confirm whether we can reach the database or whether the API is actively run, which is crucial for application which maybe you have deployed an app and the users are having issue logging in. You test the API is running, but maybe it can't reach the database for one or maybe two reasons. First, maybe let's first by importing the Prisma client. This will allow the application to communicate with the database via Prisma. We can just copy this. You can just copy this import statement at the top of the app.js where the other imports are. Yeah, so that will import our Prisma client. So now let's get to the main logic. The key here is to ensure the database check is lightweight and also it provides a clear indication of health. A simple query, which is usually the best. I think it will only be executed when the endpoint is called, so I don't think it will have any hit to our performance or anything. Now let me copy the core logic for the health check that Gemini generated and paste. Okay, I think implementing this wasn't very complex using Gemini, and let's remove the chalk. It's using chalk for login, so let's just remove it. It's a library for colored console output. Since while it may be useful for local debugging, but it isn't strictly necessary, so I'll just remove it to keep the dependencies minimal for this specific function. As you can see, the generated code, we are performing a database query. If the query returns a result, you can confidently say the database is operational. Okay, so I think that's all necessary for this endpoint. Let's save the changes and let's do some testing. So the server should have restarted automatically. Now back in Postman, let's create a new request for our test endpoint and let's send exit. We have a successful response and the status is okay, and the message confirms that the server is indeed running. It includes a timestamp, server uptime, and importantly the database status. It might show pending briefly, then update to okay once the database query completes successfully, which in our case we can see it's okay, which is really good. This is really great and it worked as expected. Okay, one feature now is down. Now let's go to the next important enhancement. So this API is intended for an application that will handle user accounts and their data. I will share more about the app itself in the future. We need to address some privacy and User rights. Specifically, we need to implement a feature allowing users to delete their account and all associated data, which is critical for compliance with regulations like GDPR, which emphasize the right to be forgotten. So the goal is to add an endpoint that when called by an authenticated user will remove their user record and the linked data from our system. So Gemini, let's see what Gemini will come up with. So for example, many platforms like Apple Store, Google Play Store, they have these strict requirements for apps that handle user data. They need to include an account deletion. So this is why this endpoint is very important. So as you can see that Gemini has generated some code here, and I think that it needs us to create dedicated endpoint for that. Okay, first things first, before we do that, let's first test the registration endpoint, which is at let me check. We need first to create a new test user. The API already has an endpoint for that at /API v1 auth and register. We can do that in Postman, and I'll set up a post request, and the body needs to be in JSON format. If we send an empty request first, we should get an error. Yes, as expected. The error indicates that the request body is missing required fields such as email, and it should also be in raw JSON. So let's provide a test email, johndoe@gmail.com. Let's provide also a password. I think that's all the required fields for successful account registration. My schema might also expect a username, but let's try with just email and password first. So the user has been registered successfully. The response include the user ID, and as expected, the first name and last name are null since we didn't provide them. Also, you have received an access token and a refresh token. Now let's verify that this new user can log in here, and as you can see, we have currently logged in with the newly created user. Okay, so these tokens, particularly the access token and the refresh token, are used to authenticate subsequent requests on protected routes. In Postman, you can add this as an authorization header with the bearer scheme. So I'll copy the access token and paste it into the token field for the bearer authentication type. With this token, should now be able to access protected routes. Maybe, for instance, the profile endpoint, which will return the user details. That is what the access tokens are used for. Okay, let's do a symbol. I'm not sure what the endpoint was. I need the endpoint to call the user details. So let me quickly look at my route definition. Okay, in the accounts. Oh, I see I had a placeholder delete feature here, but this was just a console log. It wasn't really that functionally. But it didn't implement the comprehensive data deletion that we need. So looking back at auth service, this contains our logging logic, which validates the credentials. And upon success, it generates a JWT token, which is then used for accessing protected routes. Okay, I need to find where the /me route should be one of the route definition files associated with authentication of user accounts. Let's recheck the auth routes. Yeah, and you can see I have several public routes. They register, the login, and the refresh. And the protected routes include the /me and /login. So it should be auth /me, not only me only. And yeah, okay, back. You can try calling it, and we can see it returns the user details. So let's remove the authorization header and calling it again, and it says that you are not logged in. Please log in to get access. So that confirms that our authorization header for that user account is currently working. So speaking of tooling, VS Code has a neat feature for generating commit message based on staged changes can be quite a time saver. So it analyzes the changes and suggests a commit message, like maybe fit, hard health check, endpoint, and setup for user deletion, which is quite accurate. Alright, now for the user deletion feature, I plan to create a new service file, perhaps a user service.js, which will encapsulate the logic for the user service. It will contain the functions responsible for deleting a user and all their associated data, ensuring our data handling is clean. And here is the Gemini suggestions for a delete user and data function. Well, the name is really clear, and it also provides some code comments to make everything clear and very descriptive. So let's just copy and paste the code. So I think it proposes a Prisma Cascade delete capabilities by defining relation to our Prisma schema. When a user maybe is created, or when your user is deleted, Prisma will automatically delete all the linked records in other tables, such as their tokens, accounts, and any other related entities. Importantly, I think we need to add the user controller. This will handle the incoming HTTP request for user deletion, call the service function, and manage responses. The controller will also be responsible for error handling, maybe if the user is not found, and sending the appropriate success or error messages back to the client. We can expand this controller later with other maybe some management functions, like maybe fetching or updating the profiles. But for now, let's only focus on the account deletion feature. So the controller will call the delete user data service function, passing in the user ID of the authenticated user. And now finally we need to define the route. I'll create the user route TS file for this. So this file will map an API endpoint to a delete user controller function. So the endpoint will likely be a delete request to a path, like maybe API v1 users/me, which will trigger the delete current user function in our controller. So using the /me is very common and a clear configuration to indicate that the action pertains to the currently authenticated user, maybe just to avoid ambiguity. So this structure, service, current, and shout is a standard way to organize backend logic, promoting separation of concern. Gemini suggestions align well with these common patterns. Now back in the app.ts, we need to import and mount these new user routes so that our Express application is aware of them I will add an import statement for user routes. For user routes from our new user routes file, and then we can use the app.use to mount these routes. So maybe let's do that. Okay, let's mount the routes, and I think we can import directly. We can import directly as a suggestion. It will be resolved correctly. Well, the auto import sometimes places new lines in less than ideal spots, so I'll move the import line to be concealed in my other route definitions to keep the app.ts file clean. With that, the new user deletion endpoint should be integrated into application. So time to test the endpoint. So the server always auto restarts when maybe it ran into or it crashed. It should auto restart automatically. So the expectation is that a delete request to API v1 users/me by an authenticated user will remove them from the database. To verify this, let's first open Prisma Studio to see the current state of our user data. This will serve as our before state. So Prisma is loading, and here is our user table. We currently have 2 users. First one should be the John Doe at Gmail, the one created. Yes, there it is, with the null first and last name, as we didn't provide them. So now back, let's copy this endpoint, and back in Postman we can create a delete. We can call the delete. We can call the delete HTTP method to that endpoint. So we also need to provide the authorization header with the bearer token. So when we call that without the token, it will fail. And as you can see, success, the response message is the account has been deleted and everything and all the data. So once we refresh here, we can see that John Doe is gone and the record has been removed. This confirms our deletion function is working correctly. Excellent. So that's a successful implementation. It's always satisfying to see a feature work end to end. So this AI assistant tool can significantly streamline development. So they are particularly helpful for generating boilerplate code or suggesting implementation for common patterns, which allows developers to focus more on the unique aspect of their application. So for those learning to code, these tools can also be valuable resources for understanding different approaches, provided the generated code is reviewed and understood, not just copied blindly. So as the final check, I'll try to use John Doe's hold access token to call the out/me endpoint again, and you get an error saying that the user belonging to this token no longer exists, which is correct as the user associated with that token has been deleted. So the user deletion is comprehensive and very effective, and that concludes our walkthrough of adding the health check endpoint and the user deletion feature to our API. With assistance with Gemini, I'll be continuing to develop this project, so feel free to subscribe if you would like to see more. And thank you so much for watching. If you found this tutorial helpful, please consider liking the video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'll see you in the next one.